In the second half of 1941, the German-Soviet war shifted from a campaign of movement to a struggle for endurance. On June 22, 1941, Germany and its allies opened Operation Barbarossa with 3 army groups aimed at Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. By autumn, the operational center of gravity moved to Army Group Center, whose advance toward Moscow was framed not only as a military objective, but as a political wager. The belief that the Soviet state could be forced into collapse if the capital, its rail hub, and its administrative center were taken before winter. For the Soviet leadership, the defense of Moscow became a strategic and symbolic imperative. But it was also an economic and logistical necessity. Moscow anchored the rail network, feeding multiple fronts and connected industrial regions to the north and east. The evacuation of factories to the Volga and Urals accelerated in summer and autumn, yet the capital still coordinated mobilization, training, and distribution. Public messaging emphasized national survival and discipline, while internal security measures and emergency administrations prepared for the possibility of urban fighting. By October 2, 1941, Army Group Center launched Operation Typhoon, aiming to encircle Soviet forces west of Moscow and open the road to the city. Initial encirclements around Vyazma and Bryansk produced large prisoner totals and destroyed formations, but these successes also stretched German supply systems. The advance moved faster than rail conversion and faster than the availability of serviceable trucks. Fuel and ammunition deliveries depended on road columns operating on deteriorating surfaces. By late October and November, the Rasputitsa mud season slowed movement, and freezing temperatures then created a different set of failures. Lubricants thickened, batteries lost power, metal contracted, and maintenance cycles became longer as crews worked without adequate shelter and, in many cases, without standardized winter clothing. The front southwest of Moscow, around the Nara river line and towns such as Naro-Fominsk, sat on a practical axis of operations. The locality lay roughly 70 kilometers from central Moscow and astride major roads that linked the capital to Kaluga and the western approaches. For German commanders, pushing through this sector offered a way to widen pressure on Moscow, while guarding the boundary between the main forces of Fourth Army and armoured groupings operating on the flanks. For the Soviet command, holding and then reversing the line here offered something equally concrete: restoration of road and rail security close to the capital, and the chance to disrupt German coordination at a moment when units were dispersed, undersupplied, and operating at reduced mechanical readiness. The operational environment in early December was defined by exhaustion on both sides. German formations had marched and fought for months, with replacement flows and equipment recovery increasingly unable to match losses. Soviet armies had suffered catastrophic defeats in summer and autumn, but the system still generated new units, rebuilt shattered ones, and shifted forces by rail toward threatened sectors. Western Front, defending Moscow, reorganized its command and reserves with the immediate purpose of stabilizing the line and creating local superiority for counterstrokes. This included newly formed armies and reconstituted rifle divisions, supported by artillery concentrations that could be supplied more reliably at short range from Moscow area depots. Intelligence and perception mattered as much as numbers. German planning in late 1941 reflected an assumption that the Soviet side was approaching the limits of manpower and cohesion, even as reports from the front described renewed resistance and fresh units appearing in the line. Soviet planners, in turn, assessed that German forward groups had reached a culminating point. Long supply lines, limited winter preparation, and motor transport attrition reduced the ability to sustain offensive tempo. For soldiers at the front, these assessments translated into immediate realities: reduced rations, delayed ammunition resupply, frost injuries, and the constant calculation of whether engines, weapons, and radios would function after a night in the open. Civilians in the Naro-Fominsk area experienced the same geography through a different lens. The fighting corridor brought requisitions, fortification work, displacement, and breakdown of normal administration. Villages near road junctions and river crossings were exposed to repeated occupation and artillery fire, while evacuations were constrained by transport shortages and the timing of military movements. As the first week of December began, the local population faced an unstable front line where control could change within days, and where survival depended less on political slogans than on immediate access to shelter, food, and heat. This was the context in which the Soviet winter counteroffensive opened on December 5th to 6th, 1941. Around Moscow, it was not a single battle, but a sequence of coordinated attacks along multiple axes. In the sector near Naro-Fominsk, the coming actions would center on Western Front formations, including the 33rd Army, attempting to force crossings, break prepared positions, and exploit German logistical and mechanical weakness in freezing conditions. For the German side, units linked to the southern approaches of Army Group Center, operating under severe supply strain and with vehicles increasingly difficult to maintain, would be compelled to choose between holding forward positions and preserving combat power for an orderly withdrawal. On December 5th to 6th, 1941, the Soviet winter counteroffensive opened along the Moscow approaches as a coordinated set of attacks rather than a single thrust. The Western Front, commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, held the main responsibility for the sectors immediately west and southwest of the capital. In the Nara River corridor, the operation unfolded under the 33rd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mikhail Yefremov, with the immediate task of pressing German forces back from the Naro-Fominsk line and widening the gap between German infantry and armoured groupings operating on adjacent axes. The timing mattered. German forward units in early December were positioned on a thin, extended front after weeks of offensive effort and local defensive improvisation. Army Group Center remained under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. In the southwestern approaches to Moscow, responsibility was divided between 4th Army under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and 4th Panzer Group under Colonel General Erich Harpner. Farther south, Colonel General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army faced Soviet pressure around Tula and the Oka Basin. The Soviet plan did not depend on one sector collapsing in isolation. It depended on multiple sectors forcing simultaneous decisions, creating a retreat dynamic that could not be stabilized by shifting reserves along frozen, damaged roads. In the Naro-Fominsk area, the opening phase began with artillery preparation and infantry assaults aimed at river crossings, road junctions, and the edges of built-up areas that served as German strongpoints. The Nara River and its tributaries formed a practical defensive obstacle. Low banks, ice conditions that varied by location, and approaches exposed to machine gun and mortar fire. Soviet rifle units worked in short bounds behind fire support, seeking to rupture the forward line and force German units to disengage before they could consolidate new positions. The operational goal in this first week was not a single dramatic encirclement, but the steady widening of penetrations that would make German lateral movement harder and threaten withdrawal routes toward the west. German reactions in the opening days reflected a defensive calculus shaped by shortages. Local commanders attempted to hold key villages and bridge approaches long enough to extract heavy weapons and maintain cohesion, while conducting limited counterattacks to restore broken segments of the line. Where armoured vehicles were available, they were used sparingly, often in small packets, because fuel and maintenance constraints reduced the number of machines that could be committed repeatedly. Infantry formations relied on prepared firing positions, field fortifications, and the tactical use of roads as defensive spines. At the same time, German staffs confronted a widening operational problem. In freezing conditions, the recovery of disabled vehicles required time, tow capacity, and functioning engines, all of which were increasingly unreliable. This is where the Naro-Fominsk fighting connected to the broader shock that contemporaries later emphasized. As Soviet attacks expanded on multiple axes, 2nd Panzer Army to the south was compelled into retreat under pressure and under constraints that made an orderly withdrawal difficult. Retreat for motorized formations normally depended on preserving mobility, restarting engines, keeping fuel moving, and recovering damaged tanks and trucks. In early December 1941, those assumptions broke down repeatedly. Vehicles that could not be started, that lacked fuel, or that suffered mechanical failure in the cold became immediate liabilities. Crews faced a choice between prolonged recovery efforts under fire and abandonment to keep personnel and remaining transport moving. Within German command channels, these first days produced tense coordination problems. Hitler's headquarters pushed for holding ground and avoiding retreats that might be read as strategic failure, while front-level commanders reported that positions could not be sustained without risking the loss of whole units. On the Soviet side, Stavka and Western Front leadership pressed commanders to maintain momentum, but the opening phase still demanded careful management of artillery ammunition, bridging materials, and the pace of infantry advances in deep winter conditions. The result, by the second week of December, was a rapidly changing front. Soviet forces gaining ground in increments, German forces trading space for cohesion, and the first visible evidence on roads and in rear areas that the German army, for the first time in the campaign, was leaving behind quantities of equipment it could not recover fast enough. By early December 1941, both sides planned under constraints that were visible at the operational level. The German drive on Moscow, launched as Operation Typhoon in October, had committed very large forces to a single strategic goal. One contemporary summary of the offensive describes roughly 75 divisions and almost 2 million men being directed into the effort. In practice, the closer German formations moved toward Moscow, the more their tempo depended on road transport and on keeping motor vehicles running in freezing conditions. Soviet planners assessed that this created an exploitable vulnerability. German forward positions could be held tactically, but the ability to sustain them and to maneuver reserves laterally was declining. German intent in the Naro-Fominsk sector had been shaped by the same logic that drove Typhoon: open and protect routes toward Moscow while preventing Soviet forces from striking the flanks of the main advance. In late November and early December, German Fourth Army's forward progress was checked around Naro-Fominsk, a halt that left the southern flank relationship between the Naro-Fominsk area and the Tula direction increasingly exposed, because the German armoured thrusts farther south were operating on a separate axis. Within Army Group Centre, this translated into a planning problem. If the centre could not advance, the flanks risked becoming salient-like protrusions that had to be supplied and defended without the operational payoff of reaching Moscow. On the Soviet side, Stavka and Western Front planning treated the winter counteroffensive as a sequence of linked blows rather than as an attempt to recreate a single deep encirclement immediately. The intent in the Nara corridor was to force German units to disengage from prepared positions, then make withdrawal routes and supply roads unusable through continued pressure. The experience of the final German effort at the start of December shaped Soviet assumptions. On December 1st to 2nd, German forces using a motorized grouping supported by roughly 60 to 70 tanks forced a crossing of the Nara in the 33rd Army sector, and Soviet counterstrokes and artillery fire contributed to heavy vehicle losses and forced the German column to fall back. For Soviet planners, this episode indicated both danger and opportunity. German armoured groups could still create local penetrations, but their ability to recover losses and sustain repeated thrusts was limited. Within the 33rd Army, the operational plan that led into the liberation of Naro-Fominsk later in the month was built around concentrating infantry and artillery on a narrow frontage, while adjacent formations fixed German units in place. A planning outline for the main attack phase describes the 33rd Army being tasked to break through along the Naro-Fominsk Kamenskoye sector, with the main blow directed toward Balabanovo and Maloyaroslavets, and a shock grouping formed from rifle divisions, including the 110th, 113th, and 338th, reinforced by the 1st Guards Motor Rifle Division. Other divisions were assigned pinning and second echelon roles, and coordination with the neighbouring 43rd Army was planned. The Soviet logic was operationally conservative, but cumulative. A limited breakthrough, followed by pressure on road junctions, would force German units to retreat before they could establish a stable winter line. German planning in the same period focused on holding a defensible line while preserving enough combat power to prevent a wider rupture. In 4th Panzer Group, staff assessments immediately before the Soviet counteroffensive indicated that only a small number of divisions were considered capable of renewed attack, and planned offensive action was called off as the Soviet offensive began. This produced a structural asymmetry in December. Soviet plans emphasized coordinated pressure and sequential objectives close to Moscow's supply base, while German plans increasingly became exercises in damage limitation, balancing orders to hold ground against the practical requirement to keep formations intact and mobile in conditions where vehicles, fuel, and recovery capacity were all constrained. The first contacts of the December counteroffensive in the Naro-Fominsk sector were shaped by geography and by the condition of the units that had been fighting since October. Naro-Fominsk lay on the Nara River line and on the road network leading toward Moscow. Its western districts had been under German occupation since October 21, 1941, which meant that the town and surrounding villages had already experienced weeks of requisitioning, fortification work, displacement and intermittent artillery fire before the Soviet counteroffensive began. In the days immediately before the wider Soviet offensive opened, local fighting had already tested the limits of German mobility and Soviet defensive reserves. On December 1st to 2nd, German forces conducted an attack in the 33rd Army sector north of Naro-Fominsk, achieving a temporary penetration. A Soviet counterstroke involving the 113th Rifle Division and a regiment from 43rd Army was later credited in Soviet accounts with capturing dozens of tanks and guns from the attacking group. This episode did not decide the campaign, but it established two realities for both sides. German armoured thrusts could still create short-lived breaks in the line, and the recovery of heavy equipment under fire and extreme cold was increasingly uncertain. When the Soviet winter counteroffensive expanded on December 6th, 33rd Army's early engagements focused on forcing the German forward line to yield along the Nara approaches and along the roads that fed the town from the west and southwest. The opening fighting was methodical rather than sudden. Rifle units attacked village strongpoints, tree lines, and road embankments that had been prepared for defence during the preceding weeks. Artillery support was used to suppress known firing points and to disrupt movement along the few usable roads. Progress tended to be measured in short advances, because each built-up point on the river line could be turned into a local fortress of trenches, cellars, and covered firing positions. German defences in this sector were held by formations of the 4th Army Zone, including units identified in later studies as part of the 258th Infantry Division's area during the fighting around Naro-Fominsk. Their defensive pattern emphasized holding key road nodes and delaying Soviet movement long enough to extract heavy weapons and keep battalion structures intact. Under winter conditions, this was not only a tactical requirement, but a logistical one. Withdrawals had to be staged so that field kitchens, ammunition carts, and the limited number of serviceable vehicles did not become trapped in snowbound bottlenecks. Early Soviet gains, therefore, did not always come from a single breakthrough. They often came from pressure that made a position expensive to hold relative to its value. Once a German strongpoint began to risk isolation, local commanders faced a narrow set of choices: counterattack with depleted reserves, or pull back to the next defensible line before routes were cut. On the Soviet side, 33rd Army's immediate challenge was to keep attacks synchronized across adjacent villages so that German units could not disengage from one point, shift laterally, and stabilize another. This required reliable communications in freezing weather, careful allocation of artillery ammunition, and continuous engineering work on crossings and roads. Civilians experienced the first week of the counteroffensive as a rapid change in risk, rather than a clear transition from front to rear. Towns and villages near the Nara line were exposed to repeated shelling as positions changed hands or were approached from different directions. The occupation of western Naro-Fominsk had created shortages and damage that limited shelter and heating capacity, while Soviet advances brought new requisition demands for transport animals, food and local labour to clear roads and evacuate wounded. The same houses that had been used for billets and command posts could be abandoned within hours, leaving civilians to adapt to whichever side controlled the street that day. By mid-December, the cumulative effect of these early engagements was not only territorial, it was operational. German formations were compelled to spend scarce fuel and vehicle hours on repeated repositioning, while Soviet formations tried to convert limited penetrations into a broader push toward the town. In later accounts of the Moscow counteroffensive's central sector, Naro-Fominsk is repeatedly treated as a slower-moving fight than the more dramatic retreats elsewhere, with its liberation occurring only after sustained pressure rather than a single decisive stroke. By mid-December, the fighting around Naro-Fominsk shifted from initial probing and localized attacks into a more organized offensive effort with higher stakes for both commands. In the 33rd Army sector, the transition was marked by the decision to concentrate forces for a deliberate breakthrough rather than rely on incremental, village-by-village pressure. The operational problem was clear. German positions on the Nara line and the road approaches to Naro-Fominsk had been reinforced with field fortifications since late October, and the winter conditions restricted manoeuvre to a limited number of roads and frozen tracks. The main push by 33rd Army opened on December 18th after a planned artillery preparation. Yefremov formed a shock grouping from the 110th, 113th, and 338th Rifle Divisions and the 1st Guards Motor Rifle Division. Other formations, including the 222nd Rifle Division, were assigned to hold and fix the enemy on adjacent sectors, while the 201st Rifle Division was kept as a second echelon intended to reinforce success or restore momentum if the first wave stalled. The shock group deployed on a frontage of about 16 kilometers, a compromise between concentrating firepower and covering enough ground to prevent German units from slipping away to secondary positions. Opposing this attack were German formations described in contemporary operational summaries as depleted elements of the 3rd Motorized Division, the 183rd Infantry Division, the 20th Panzer Division, and part of the 15th Infantry Division. Their immediate objective was less to restore the earlier offensive toward Moscow than to prevent a rupture that could force a wider withdrawal across the central sector. Defensive planning in this phase relied on holding road junctions and built-up points as anchors, while using small mobile reserves for local counterattacks, and to cover withdrawals from forward trenches to the next line. Escalation came from the mismatch between intent and conditions. Soviet planning assumed that a short, concentrated thrust would open space for exploitation toward Balabanovo and, eventually, Maloyaroslavets, threatening German lateral communications and forcing German units to retreat under pressure rather than by schedule. In practice, the first days of the attack showed how difficult it was to convert an initial artillery-supported assault into operational movement. Snow, limited visibility, and the need to clear defended villages slowed rifle formations. Engineering work on crossings, roads, and evacuation routes competed directly with ammunition and food transport on the same narrow road network. By December 20th, Soviet reports described the offensive in this sector as developing poorly, even after the commitment of the 201st Rifle Division. Units remained close to their starting lines in several areas, indicating that German defences, even when undersupplied and reduced, could still absorb a frontal push when the attacker could not rapidly outflank strongpoints. For the Soviet side, this created a crisis of tempo. continued attacks risked high daily losses without decisive territorial change, but a pause risked giving German units time to rebuild a coherent winter line. For the German side, the crisis was different, but equally concrete. The ability to hold depended on maintaining cohesion while moving supplies and heavy weapons in freezing temperatures. Where vehicles could not be started or repaired quickly, commanders had to decide whether to risk recovery under fire or abandon equipment to preserve manpower and keep the remaining transport moving. Even when a defensive position held tactically, the cumulative effect of constant Soviet pressure on roads and rear areas increased the probability that a withdrawal, when finally ordered or forced, would leave behind disabled vehicles, guns, and stores. Civilians in and around Naro-Fominsk experienced this escalation as intensified destruction of infrastructure that both armies needed. Roads were cut by shelling and traffic. Buildings were used as strongpoints and then damaged by artillery, and remaining food stocks were reduced by repeated requisitions and by the disruption of normal distribution. As the front line shifted back and forth on the outskirts and along approach routes, the distinction between rear and front collapsed into a pattern of short-range movement, sheltering, and uncertainty about control of the next village or bridge. The peak of the Naro-Fominsk fighting came in the third week of December, when 33rd Army tried to convert slow gains into a decisive rupture. After the deliberate assault began on December 18th, the battlefield condensed into a series of short-range battles for villages, road bends, and the edges of the town itself. In this winter environment, shelter dictated tactics. Infantry could not remain for long in open ground without severe cold exposure, so buildings, cellars, and dugouts became objectives and defensive anchors. That reality narrowed maneuver and pushed both sides toward repeated assaults on the same inhabited points, even when the surrounding terrain offered space on the map. For Soviet commanders, the central requirement was to keep the attack moving despite the friction created by snowbound roads and the time required to reduce fortified villages. Artillery and mortars had to be brought forward along the same few routes used for food, ammunition, and casualty evacuation. Where forward units gained a foothold, engineers worked to improve crossings and to clear lanes for guns and sled traffic. The cost of the peak phase was not only casualties from fire, but also the degradation of unit effectiveness from cold injuries, exhaustion, and the breakdown of communications in freezing conditions. German commanders faced a different peak problem, defending while the higher command narrowed their options. As Soviet pressure expanded along the Moscow front, German field headquarters received increasingly rigid guidance to hold positions and stabilize the line. This coincided with leadership decisions in mid to late December that emphasized standing fast, limiting discretionary withdrawals, even when local commanders judged them necessary to avoid losses of equipment and cohesion. The practical consequence in sectors like Naro-Fominsk was that units often delayed disengagement until the last workable moment, increasing the likelihood that heavy weapons, trucks, and damaged armored vehicles could not be recovered under fire and in deep cold. This is the phase in which the abandoned equipment theme becomes operationally concrete rather than anecdotal. A withdrawal by a motorized unit in winter required three conditions at once: engines that would start, fuel that could reach the forward elements, and enough recovery capacity to tow disabled vehicles. If any one of these failed, abandonment became a rational choice to preserve manpower and prevent complete encirclement. Soviet troops, advancing along roads and into vacated positions, repeatedly encountered the physical evidence of this equation. Vehicles left in ditches or on road shoulders, guns that could not be hauled away fast enough, and equipment stripped of usable parts by their crews before departure. German forces did not abandon equipment because they ceased to value it. They abandoned it because the combination of weather, Soviet pressure, and constrained movement made retrieval slower than the pace of retreat. At the tactical level, the peak period around December 20th to 24th was defined by short cycles of attack, counterattack, and partial withdrawal. German defenders sought to hold long enough to extract heavy weapons and maintain a continuous line. Soviet attackers sought to keep contact and deny the defenders the time needed to reorganize on the next position. The resulting pattern looked less like a single breakthrough and more like successive collapses of local strongpoints, each one forcing the next. Morale on both sides was shaped by immediate material conditions. For Soviet units, the appearance of abandoned vehicles and stores provided practical resources and a visible sign that German mobility was failing. For German units, the same sight confirmed that the retreat was consuming combat power faster than replacements and repairs could restore it. Civilians trapped in the Naro-Fominsk area experienced the peak phase primarily as intensified destruction and acute scarcity. The battles for inhabited points meant repeated damage to housing that provided heat and cover. Food stocks were reduced by interruption of supply and by repeated military demands, while movement out of the combat zone depended on whether roads were open and whether transport could be spared. Even where occupation ended, the immediate environment remained hazardous. Mines, unexploded shells, burned buildings, and the collapse of basic services turned liberation or withdrawal into the beginning of another survival problem. By the days immediately before December 26th, the operational logic of the battle became clear. Soviet forces aimed to take Naro-Fominsk not simply as a symbolic town, but as a road and river node that would make the German line west of Moscow harder to supply and harder to hold. German forces aimed to avoid encirclement and preserve a defensible winter position farther west. The peak of the campaign, therefore, was less a single climactic engagement than the moment when German defense in this sector ceased to be a question of holding ground and became a question of how much material and cohesion could be saved during the inevitable withdrawal. As the December fighting intensified, both sides adapted in ways that reflected the limits of their 1941 systems. For 33rd Army, the problem was maintaining pressure when progress depended on reducing defended villages and moving artillery forward on a narrow road network. The army shifted toward tighter coordination between rifle units and fire support, shorter, repeated artillery concentrations against known strongpoints, night movement to close distances before daylight fire, and the systematic use of engineers to keep crossings and supply tracks open under snow and shell damage. In this phase, captured German material became operationally useful rather than symbolic. Vehicles or weapons taken intact could be redistributed locally, while fuel, tools, and winter clothing recovered in abandoned positions reduced immediate shortages at the front edge. German defensive adaptation in the same period emphasized controlled delay. Instead of trying to restore the October-November offensive posture, many units relied on strongpoint defense tied to roads and built-up areas, supported by small mobile groups used as rear guards and local counterattack forces. The goal was to trade limited ground for time, extracting heavy weapons and maintaining unit cohesion. This was complicated by winter mechanics. Even before the main Soviet push, 33rd Army had faced German attacks in its sector that included 2 divisions supported by about 70 tanks, showing that German armoured assets were still present, but increasingly difficult to sustain in repeated actions under freezing conditions. As withdrawals expanded across the Moscow front, the recovery equation tightened. A tank or truck that did not start after an overnight freeze, or that lacked fuel at the moment of movement, could not be towed quickly enough if roads were under fire or clogged with traffic. Improvisation became routine. German accounts from formations operating in this zone describe substituting local transport and incorporating captured Soviet equipment to offset losses and supply gaps, a sign that standard logistical flows were no longer reliable at the forward edge. Soviet units, operating closer to Moscow area depots, still faced shortages, but they could often move ammunition and food by shorter routes, and they increasingly exploited the fact that German forces were compelled to withdraw under pressure rather than by a fully staged timetable. Morale indicators on both sides followed practical conditions. Soviet troops often read abandoned vehicles and stores as evidence that German movement was constrained, while German troops experienced each delayed disengagement as a higher probability that guns, trucks, and wounded could not be extracted intact. The civilian landscape shaped these adaptations. In the Naro-Fominsk area, the same buildings needed for shelter were also used as firing points, command posts, and medical stations. So fighting for inhabited places repeatedly destroyed the infrastructure required for winter survival. The 1st Guards Moscow Motor Rifle Division, which had been assigned to 33rd Army in October and fought in the Naro-Fominsk area, had already lost about 70% of its personnel during the earlier urban fighting before withdrawing in late October. Those earlier losses influenced how Soviet commanders in December balanced direct assaults on built-up points against the need to preserve assault strength for the final push. By late December, the contest in this sector was increasingly decided by which side could keep units supplied, warmed, and moving along the few usable routes while denying the same conditions to the opponent. The turning point in the Naro-Fominsk sector came when German defense shifted from holding the town as a forward anchor to treating it as a liability that could trap units on the wrong side of the river and road network. By late December, the Soviet method of sustained pressure had produced a practical effect. German positions were no longer being evaluated only by their tactical strength, but by whether they could be supplied, reinforced, and evacuated under continuous attack and in freezing conditions. For 33rd Army, the critical requirement was to deny the defenders time. Soviet units increased the tempo of short-range actions, pushing into the gaps between village strongpoints, cutting side roads with patrols and fire, and using artillery to disrupt movement along the few routes that could carry trucks and guns. The objective was not only to enter Naro-Fominsk, but to make the withdrawal corridor west of the town uncertain enough that German commanders would have to choose an earlier disengagement. German command decisions in this phase were shaped by the broader retreat unfolding south and west of Moscow. In the weeks after December 6th, German formations across Army Group Center were being forced back to avoid piecemeal encirclement and to shorten supply lines. In the southern approaches, 2nd Panzer Army under Guderian was under pressure to retreat from advanced positions near Tula and beyond. The Naro-Fominsk sector was therefore connected to a wider operational problem. If armoured and motorised forces to the south were pulling back, holding a forward pocket near the Nara risked creating an exposed shoulder that Soviet armies could attack from multiple directions. The turning point became visible at ground level in the behaviour of withdrawal preparations. In earlier phases of the campaign, German units often pulled back with most heavy equipment, using recovery vehicles and organised march columns. In late December 1941, the combination of cold, fuel constraints, and Soviet pressure reduced that capacity. Vehicles that had been kept running intermittently to save fuel were harder to restart. Batteries failed, lubricants thickened, and towing capacity was limited by road conditions and by the need to move wounded and essential supplies first. As Soviet troops pressed into vacated positions, they encountered the material record of that breakdown. Disabled tanks and trucks left where they stalled, guns that could not be hauled away before routes were cut, and stores abandoned when columns had to keep moving. For German soldiers, this was a change in the meaning of retreat. A planned withdrawal normally preserved unit identity and material. Here, the withdrawal itself consumed resources. Crews stripped parts, drained fuel where possible, and destroyed what they could not take. But time and exposure limited what could be done. For Soviet soldiers, captured equipment and abandoned vehicles were practical gains and also intelligence indicators. They suggested that German units were leaving positions under constraints rather than by choice. On December 26th, Soviet forces entered and secured Naro-Fominsk, ending roughly 2 months of German control of its western parts. The liberation did not erase the tactical reality that the German army remained capable of organized defense farther west, but it marked a shift in momentum close to Moscow. The town's recovery improved Soviet control of local roads and reduced the immediate threat to the capital from this corridor, while forcing German Fourth Army formations to establish a new winter line under pressure and with reduced motor transport. For civilians, the turning point was not an instant return to normal administration. The transfer of control brought immediate needs: shelter in damaged buildings, medical care, food distribution, and the clearance of mines and unexploded ordnance. Families who had endured occupation faced investigations, housing loss, and shortages intensified by winter. For both armies, the capture of Naro-Fominsk was therefore both operational and logistical. It shifted the map, but it also shifted where units could be fed, warmed, and moved, and where the next defensive line would have to be built in a landscape already damaged by weeks of fighting. After the capture of Naro-Fominsk on December 26, 1941, the immediate military situation shifted from assault to consolidation. For 33rd Army and neighbouring Western Front formations, the town's recovery solved a short-range operational problem: securing a road and river node close to Moscow and pushing the front line westward enough to reduce direct pressure on the capital's southwestern approaches. For the German side, the loss of the position compelled a reorganization of the local defense into a new winter line based on terrain that could be held with reduced mobility and shortened supply routes. German withdrawal in this sector did not resemble a single ordered movement. It was a sequence of staged disengagements conducted under continuing Soviet contact. Rearguards were used to delay Soviet advances at crossings, road forks, and village edges long enough to move infantry, wounded, and essential supplies. In ideal conditions, such a retreat would also extract artillery, motor transport, and disabled vehicles through recovery and towing. In late December 1941, those conditions were uneven. Fuel constraints, limited towing capacity, blocked roads, and mechanical failures in extreme cold meant that some equipment could not be moved when schedules tightened. Crews faced trade-offs between time spent recovering a disabled vehicle and the risk of losing personnel or being cut off from the main route. Where withdrawal had to be accelerated, abandonment of heavy items became an outcome of constrained movement rather than a separate decision to discard material. For Soviet forces, the aftermath included the immediate problem of holding what had been taken. Combat units had to establish security on the approaches, screen for counterattacks, and restore command and control lines into the town. Supply services moved forward, but the road network was damaged by shelling, traffic, and winter conditions, and the same routes had to carry ammunition, food, medical evacuation, and engineer stores. Engineers focused on improving crossings, clearing obstacles, and restoring basic movement on roads needed for artillery and logistics. Captured stores and usable vehicles reduced local shortages in some units, but they also required repair capacity, drivers, and fuel that could be integrated into Soviet supply systems. Civilian conditions defined much of the immediate post-combat reality. 2 months of occupation and weeks of fighting left housing damaged, heating scarce, and food distribution disrupted. Buildings that had served as defensive points or command posts were often partially destroyed, and civilians who had sheltered in basements or improvised shelters faced the onset of deep winter with limited resources. Medical needs expanded beyond battle casualties to include frost injuries, malnutrition, and illness linked to cold and displacement. Restoration of local administration depended on communication with rear authorities, but transport and staffing were constrained by ongoing operations and the condition of infrastructure. Security measures also shaped the aftermath. In a zone that had experienced occupation, both military and state authorities prioritized control of movement identification of collaborators or suspected agents, and the prevention of sabotage. These measures affected civilians unevenly, depending on documentation, local relationships, and the speed at which administrative structures reappeared. At the same time, the rapid movement of front lines left behind hazards that required systematic clearance: mines, booby traps, unexploded shells, and damaged bridges. Even after the town's capture, the area remained within artillery range and vulnerable to air attack when weather permitted, so civilian rebuilding began under continuing risk. For the German formations pulled back from Naro-Fominsk, the immediate consequence was a reduction of forward exposure, but also a reduction of combat power. A retreat conducted under pressure typically resulted in a mix of outcomes: units that preserved cohesion and most heavy weapons, units that arrived with personnel but reduced equipment, and rear elements that were delayed or lost. The broader German operational priority in late December was to stabilize the front closer to supply bases and to create a defensible winter posture that could be held with limited mobility. This required reassigning depleted battalions, redistributing artillery, and rebuilding communications under conditions where vehicles, horses, and manpower had all been strained by the preceding months. For the Soviet side, the end of combat in Naro-Fominsk did not mean the end of operational demands. The Western Front counteroffensive continued beyond December 26th, with pressure aimed at pushing German forces farther from Moscow and denying them time to establish a strong, continuous winter line. The Naro-Fominsk outcome therefore became a logistical and organizational pivot. It opened routes, changed the placement of depots and medical points, and provided a more secure base area for the next phase, while also imposing the costs of garrisoning, repairing, and administering a damaged town in winter conditions. The Naro-Fominsk counterattack sits inside a larger turning phase of the war: the Soviet winter counteroffensive of December 1941 to early 1942, and the first major reversal of German operational momentum on the Moscow axis. In purely territorial terms, the recovery of one town did not decide the campaign. The German army retained the ability to form new defensive lines farther west, and the front stabilized into a winter posture that would later connect to prolonged fighting in the central sector in 1942. The significance of Naro-Fominsk lies in what it illustrates about systems under stress: logistics, winter operations, command authority, and the limits of mechanized warfare when mobility can no longer be assumed. Operationally, the battle highlights the relationship between local nodes and theatre outcomes. Naro-Fominsk mattered because it sat on routes that supported the defense of Moscow and because control of river crossings and roads shaped the ability to supply, redeploy, and evacuate. Soviet success there reduced immediate operational pressure on the capital's southwestern approaches and helped expand a buffer zone that improved short-range security. For the German side, its loss reinforced the shift from offensive plans to a defensive calculus, focused on shortening lines and preserving combat power. The event is often remembered as a shock to German command confidence, but its more concrete legacy is the confirmation that the 1941 campaign had reached a culminating point where further advances could not be sustained at acceptable logistical cost. The theme of abandoned equipment has a lasting place in how the December fighting is described. It can be misread as a simple measure of morale, when it is also a measure of mechanical and logistical conditions. Cold affected batteries, lubricants, and starting systems, fuel shortages restricted engine idling, roads concentrated traffic into bottlenecks, and Soviet pressure reduced the time available for recovery and towing. Under those constraints, equipment loss during withdrawal did not require a collapse of discipline to occur. At the same time, for soldiers encountering disabled tanks, trucks, and guns left behind, the physical evidence carried psychological weight. It provided practical resources and also signaled that the opponent's mobility was constrained. In that sense, Abandoned equipment became both a material and informational factor in how units assessed momentum. The battle's association with Guderian reflects a wider issue in wartime narrative: the tension between sector-level events and later memoir frameworks. Guderian commanded 2nd Panzer Army farther south, and his withdrawal under Soviet pressure was part of the broader December retreat dynamic affecting the entire central theatre. Naro-Fominsk itself was primarily within the operational sphere of German forces closer to the 4th Army and 4th Panzer Group boundary. The Guderian label persists because contemporaries and later writers often used prominent names as shorthand for the broader German retreat near Moscow, and because German command disputes in December 1941 became central to post-war interpretations. Questions about whether holding orders worsened material losses, whether earlier withdrawals could have preserved more combat power, and how far winter preparedness and supply planning shaped outcomes. For Soviet operational history, Naro-Fominsk supports a different set of debates. One concerns the balance between deliberate methods and exploitation. The December counteroffensive near Moscow combined local breakthroughs with slower fights against fortified villages and road nodes. The Naro-Fominsk timeline, culminating only on December 26th, shows that even when strategic momentum shifted, tactical progress could remain incremental when terrain, weather, and defended strongpoints forced repeated assaults. Another debate concerns force generation and sustainability. The ability to assemble and coordinate multiple armies close to Moscow depended on mobilization, rail movement, and the concentration of artillery and supplies at short range. That advantage was structural rather than episodic, and it framed what could be attempted in December and what could be sustained afterward. The civilian legacy is often less visible in operational summaries, but remained persistent on the ground. Liberation did not immediately restore housing, heating, food distribution, or medical care in winter. It brought administrative return and security measures, but also continued exposure to hazards left by combat and to the ongoing demands of a moving front. For local communities, the battle's end was a change in control and the beginning of recovery work under wartime scarcity. Historically, the Naro-Fominsk counterattack contributes to how the winter of 1941–42 is understood. Not as the end of German fighting capacity, and not as a single decisive collapse, but as a shift in the balance of operational possibilities. It demonstrated that German formations could be compelled to abandon forward positions near Moscow, that mechanized advantage could be blunted by weather and logistics, and that Soviet command could coordinate multi-axis pressure close to a major supply base. In that way, the battle's legacy is less about a single dramatic moment and more about a documented transition, from a campaign defined by German operational initiative to a prolonged war in which both sides increasingly fought within the limits imposed by supply, manpower replacement, and the ability to endure.